Wisdom for Cooling the Flames. This book was written by Thich Nhat Hanh and was published by Riverhead Books 2002. Before delving into the key points of this book, let's take a closer look at the author's life and experience. Thich Nhat Hanh was a Vietnamese Buddhist monk who was famous for his commitment to non-violent activism. During the Vietnam War, he was imprisoned, tortured, and eventually forced into exile. He only returned to Vietnam in the 2000s after living in the USA for many years, where he became friends with Martin Luther King and also several years in France. He wrote 3 books on the history of Buddhism in Vietnam and poems that have been translated into many languages. And now for the analysis of the book, starting with the first key concept. In spite of all our setbacks and difficulties, life tends to attract happiness. Human life revolves around a continuous search for happiness. Every action, every thought, and every goal that we set ourselves is simply an attempt by which to achieve well-being and find something that can make us truly happy. We are not always successful, and what we choose to pursue is not always really in our own interests. So why is this? Mental patterns often make our choices more complex as they feed on negative feelings such as anger, jealousy, and disappointment, and end up making us feel trapped. Freeing ourselves from these patterns and the emotional and behavioral mechanisms they trigger is the key to achieving true happiness. We should avoid seeing this problem as a kind of rivalry, however, between one side of us that seeks its own well-being and the other that wants us to be unhappy. Splitting ourselves in two, in fact, often leads to problems. A rash choice, for instance, might be the result of another unexpressed desire, which we have ignored for too long. We often compartmentalize the human experience into good and evil, body and mind, but this suppresses our natural internal communication that serves as our inner guide, and which lies at the core of Buddhist teachings. According to Buddha, body and mind are not separate entities, but represent a unity called Namarupa, which sometimes manifests as a wave and sometimes as a particle in a similar way to light. Embracing the teachings of Buddhism helps us to reconcile the delicate issues of inner and outer existence. Thich Nhat Hanh explains the spirit of Buddhism in this book and provides practical solutions that can help us overcome one of the main threats to our inner balance: anger. Buddhism teaches us that anger is a deeply rooted seed that we must handle with care in order to best cultivate our well-being. Anger is one of the strongest human emotions, and like a stubborn weed, it often spreads rapidly. Just like everything that occurs in nature, however, it has an important role to play. Anger is usually connected to suffering. When we are angry with someone, it tends to be the result of the emotional pain that they have caused us, and we often want to hurt them back in some way. This leads to a vicious cycle, which only causes further suffering for everyone involved. Letting our anger take over also changes our physical appearance, because when we are angry, the muscles in our face tense up, and over time, this becomes our natural expression. Although it may seem relatively insignificant, this physical manifestation of anger highlights an important aspect of human evolution. Seeing tension in someone else instinctively provokes fear and pushes us to run away from them, both physically and figuratively. Anger can be like a bomb, primed to detonate, and can push our loved ones away. Just like a plant, however, it can also be nurtured and cared for, and can eventually become something valuable and useful. It takes time and patience to learn how to manage our anger, and we have to acknowledge it with tenderness and compassion. Everyone has a seed of anger within them, and completely uprooting it only damages its potential to help us. A perfect ecosystem needs many different plant, animal, and fungal species to survive, even if they are in conflict with one another. Similarly, the human soul needs contradiction. The seed of anger, however, must be allowed to flourish without becoming overly intrusive, so that it does not spread too far. Anger is often passed down from generation to generation and from parents to children. When we are angry, we tend to think that we have no need for other people. Independence is important, but in order to love, we have to break down the barriers between ourselves and the outside world. We have to be willing to take care of ourselves so that we, in turn, are able to help our loved ones. Change is a fundamental aspect of life, but it can feel overwhelming, so the author provides several very helpful exercises to deal with our anger when something happens to change our status quo. Mindfulness allows us to rediscover who we are. Working on ourselves is a never-ending, lifelong process. When seeking solutions to specific, practical issues, we need equally specific exercises. Buddhism offers numerous insights which at first glance may not seem very practical, but as we have already seen, body and mind are a single entity, and working on a better symbiosis between them is a driving force of great change. Mindfulness is a key exercise in Buddhism and helps us rid ourselves of anger, envy, and disappointment. It is closely related to meditation and helps us become aware of our movements, thoughts, and emotions, and to focus on the present moment. It can be done, for instance, while sipping tea. Each sip represents a connection between our body and another physical element, and each emotion we feel is just as real because it comes as a result of this connection. So even the simplest actions can help us remain present in every thought and action. We might also meditate while walking. As we become aware of our feet touching the ground, our thoughts open up and begin to unravel, and so do negative feelings, such as anger. There are countless ways to meditate. After all, meditation is a form of prayer, and as such can be considered a divine practice. Thich Nhat Hanh suggests a relatively simple, deep relaxation exercise. We start by lying down on a surface, such as a bed or a floor, close our eyes and relax. We then focus on the contact between our body and the surface and on the interaction while breathing mindfully. Our breathing should become a rhythm that marks our awareness of each part of our body. We inhale and exhale, concentrating on our feet, feeling grateful that they are connected to everything above them. Then we move on to our legs and gradually continue upwards. Initially, we should start with the abdomen, as this is where our breath takes shape. Our body carries and stores everything that it experiences in everyday life, so while it is helpful to practice mindfulness exercises, we must also be aware of the way in which we live our life. There are 5 positive attitudes we should try to develop: reverence for life, generosity, sexual and relational responsibility, deep listening, and conscious consumption. The last 2 aspects in particular warrant a closer look. Thich Nhat Hanh's advice on how to communicate effectively. In human relationships, communication can be both a blessing and a curse. A good, stimulating conversation makes us feel good and helps us forget the problems of everyday life. Poor communication, on the other hand, increases our sense of frustration, anger, paranoia, and anxiety. We know that in order for dialogue to be effective, it has to be able to lead each participant into a neutral area. Our individuality has to take a back seat so that it can merge, mold, and rebuild itself with the other person. And this concept aligns perfectly with the teachings of Buddhism. It is no coincidence that Buddhism places particular importance on compassionate and loving listening. When speaking, we often struggle to understand exactly what the other person is trying to say. We tend to attribute a personal meaning to another person's concepts, ideas, or words, but in order to really understand them, we should calmly focus on what they are trying to communicate, including their non-verbal signals. The author urges us to pay close attention to what the other person is telling us, because in the case of an argument, it can make all the difference. Good communication requires commitment and constant effort. To some extent, human relationships are almost always complicated, but good communication is able to solve even the most challenging situations. In order for dialogue to be effective, we have to let the other person express themselves, giving space to their words and feelings without intervening with opinions or analyses. When someone tells us about something difficult that is happening in their life, our aim should be to make them feel better and to help them get rid of negative emotions, so it is crucial that they do not feel judged. Anger is a legitimate feeling and needs to be expressed, but it must not become an excuse to lash out at other people in the hope that it will make us feel better. In a relationship between 2 people, the consequences of any given action are never one-sided. If we say something nasty to our loved one, for instance, it is like we are also saying it to ourselves. Sometimes we accumulate a great deal of pent-up anger in a relationship, and in these cases it is helpful to come up with a strategy that will help everyone involved deal with the emotion. We might also negotiate peace strategies with our partner, which reflect both people's preferences, such as meditating or exercising together or discussing emotionally pressing issues. We tend to believe that our partner will not want to discuss particularly difficult issues, but every person unconsciously seeks contact with other people, and especially with those we love. We should not be afraid to make the first move, not least because our beliefs and fears are often unfounded. Anger feeds on misperceptions, which we are only able to challenge by communicating. It is not always easy, but it is key in achieving happiness, which is based on love and compassion. Thich Nhat Hanh suggests we try to get over our anger by the end of each day and to communicate as much as possible. Our fear of conflict is sometimes very strong, and anger feeds on this fear, but the deep respect we feel for the other person should give us courage. It is no coincidence that in many South Asian cultures, a formal, almost reverential respect is the main pillar of any close relationship. Mindfulness teaches us how to really listen, and that listening is a vital therapeutic exercise. Mindful consumption fosters a greater connection with the world and with ourselves. A key aspect of mindfulness is consuming consciously. Everything we consume, from food to TV shows, is the product of a network of relationships, and it is important to be aware of how this relationship is created and nurtured. Much of what we are used to eating, for example, is produced through unsustainable farming and cultivation methods. What's more, intensive livestock farming results in enormous suffering, which ignites and breeds anger, and this gives anger even more power. We should also use mindfulness to be aware of what we eat. When chewing, we should savor our food and eat a wide variety of foods that respect the natural cycles of the season. This concept can be applied to every product that we physically or mentally consume. It is also very helpful to only read material that supplies us with knowledge about the world, and that is free of anger and hatred. Consumption is one side of a coin, and the other is creation. Neither could exist without the other. Creativity is a key factor for a happy life, and while the author says that not everyone is born with innate creativity, everyone can cultivate their creative side. According to the author, writing is a powerful tool in mindfulness. Writing down our thoughts of love, compassion, and respect is a form of meditation and of being an active participant in the present moment. Practicing mindfulness helps us take control of our life, however brief and insignificant it may seem in the grand scheme of existence. It is impossible to enjoy good conversation with our friends, to have a happy, loving relationship, or to eat well if we fail to take care of ourselves. Love must always come from a healthy place of self-love, and in order to understand what the other person wants to share with us, we have to be able to communicate effectively with the most hidden parts of who we are, and with our most complex desires and innermost fears. According to Buddhism, people are not separate entities, and the self is composed of many external elements, such as our parents, the sun, or the sea. This external part of the self intuitively understands contradictions and recognizes the underlying reasons behind each and every gesture. It sees the anger behind violent behavior that has been inherited from previous generations, and it sees the hatred that leads to terrible and unthinkable outcomes. This understanding helps us refrain from lashing out at those responsible because we recognize that they are simply victims in a long and complex process. It is sometimes necessary, however, to take a stand. This does not mean that we have to use anger and aggression to defend a given point of view, but that we should try to create a space for awareness. Teachers, for instance, should understand that a problem child is largely a result of their parents' inner anger and must learn to work with them, not least because anger in children is often a symptom of wider social issues. Just because someone is angry does not mean that they are incapable of feeling love and acceptance. Some might see choosing compassion and acceptance as a passive approach. As we have seen, however, choosing to tame the anger within and around us requires effort and proactivity. It depends on our constant commitment and on our willingness to have a truly positive effect both on our loved ones and on society as a whole. In today's world, cases of depression are increasing steadily, and suicide rates are alarmingly high, as many people are no longer able to find safe spaces in which they feel comfortable enough to express their emotions. There are fewer and fewer of these safe spaces in which to take refuge and hide from the anger in the world, and this inevitably causes life to become less valuable. Embracing mindfulness is like discovering a beacon of hope. It is a prayer that we whisper to the world with kindness. It helps break down even the most deeply rooted mental patterns, those that prevent the natural flow of life in a perpetual state of change, which in Sanskrit is called samyojana. Mindfulness also teaches us how to find value in what humans tend to fear the most of all, death. We will begin to nurture a deep-seated respect for the finiteness of things and for our own future old age, and what we choose to embrace on our own path through life. This concludes our summary of anger. If you are interested in exploring any of the topics mentioned above further, why not read the complete book? Now let's look at some of the most interesting quotes from the book. The most basic condition for happiness is freedom. The Buddha never advised us to suppress our anger. He taught us to go back to ourselves and take good care of it. Most of the time, anger is born from a wrong perception. Father, forgive me, for they know not what they do. You are more than your emotions. And finally, before we leave you, here are the main take-home messages from the book. Anger, envy, and resentment are emotions that have a highly toxic impact on our well-being. They are contagious and capable of undermining any interpersonal relationship, no matter how strong it may be. They are, however, natural feelings, which means that they have a purpose. The key to happiness is learning how to manage these emotions mindfully, tapping into our feelings of love and compassion, also when interacting with other people. Buddhism teaches awareness, and mindfulness helps us to be an active participant in the present moment, no matter how complex that might be. By being open to confrontation with ourselves and with others, we give space to what unites us, and therefore also to happiness. It is not always easy and requires great commitment, but the joy of feeling that we are part of existence in its universal entirety is well worth it.